Hello and welcome to the 8th episode of Anarchist Commentaries. Julie Borowski recently made a video called Socialism Isn't Cool, in which she attempts to explain why she has that belief. However, the video's not very good. So, being the self-hating masochist that I am, I'm going to sit through this video and explain why a right-wing libertarian is wrong on the internet for the billionth fucking time.
What's the difference between socialism and capitalism? In socialism, people wait for bread. In capitalism, bread waits for you.
And if you don't have any money, then you starve while the bread rots.
In this old clip, Bernie Sanders has good things to say about food rationing.
Bernie Sanders isn't a socialist, he's a social democrat. Social democracy and actual socialism are two very different things. If they were the same thing, then perhaps the German Social Democratic Party wouldn't have shot Rosa Luxemburg. Moving on.
You know, it's funny, sometimes American journalists talk about how bad a country is because people are lining up for food. That's a good thing. In other countries, people don't line up for food. The rich get the food and the poor starve to death.
That's a fair comment. Countries like Cuba are a far cry from the kind of society which I advocate, but economic inequality is still a huge issue in the United States. The average worker has to work 1 month to earn what the CEO gets in 1 hour. That's a huge disparity, and if you don't think that's a problem, then you should probably rethink your politics. I can just as easily bring up pictures of long dole queues in glorious capitalist America during the Great Depression.
Socialism isn't cool, guys.
I'm not meaning this to be snarky, but the tone of voice that you're using here seems more appropriate for an audience of young children. You know, 5, 6-ish.
Making everyone equally poor is not progress.
In 1936 in Spain, there was an anarchist social revolution in which a minimum of 1,838,000 people participated in setting up worker self-management of industry and agriculture. People kicked out corporate bureaucrats and started running their own shit and improving their working conditions. The anarchist women's organisation, Mujeres Libres, Free Women, was involved in setting up literacy programmes and providing people with reproductive health care. To quote George Orwell in Homage to Catalonia, "Up here in Aragon, one was among tens of thousands of people, mainly, though not entirely, of working class origin, all living at the same level and mingling on terms of equality. In theory, it was perfect equality, and even in practice, it was not far from it. There is a sense in which it would be true to say that one was experiencing a foretaste of socialism, by which I mean that the prevailing mental atmosphere was that of socialism. Many of the normal motives of civilized life, snobbishness, money grubbing, fear of the boss, etc., had simply ceased to exist. The ordinary class division of society had disappeared to an extent that is almost unthinkable in the money-tainted air of England. There was no one there except the peasants and ourselves, and no one owned anyone else as his master." I don't know about you, but that seems like progress to me.
49% of people aged 18 to 29 have a positive view of socialism. Yikes!
Faster, school, faster!
I've never understood how young people who tend to be anti-authority, let people control their own destiny, peace and harmony, would be for socialism. A centralized, top-down system where the government decides?
Socialism doesn't necessarily entail that. Well, it does if you're a Leninist, but lots of socialists are against Leninism and oppose the idea of the state centrally planning the economy because it recreates the kind of oppression that already exists under capitalism. To say that socialism is just when the state centrally plans the economy ignores the fact that there exists an anarchist faction of the socialist movement which historically has always been in conflict with the Leninist factions who want central planning. For example, during the Spanish Revolution, the Communist Party attempted to destroy the collectives that had been created by the anarchists. And also in Soviet Russia, anarchists started a rebellion in Kronstadt because the institutions of workers' control had been destroyed by the state, and the anarchists felt that this was a betrayal of socialist principles. And naturally the state did its thing and killed thousands of people. To blanketly assert that socialism is when the state manages the economy is to ignore the fact that historically, there have been huge ideological debates and physical confrontations between different socialist factions over this issue. There's a huge difference between the kind of socialism that existed in revolutionary Catalonia in 1936 and the kind of system that they had in the USSR. You don't seem to be aware of this.
Even if you have the smartest leaders, the best leaders, people with great intentions, the economy cannot be centrally planned. The economy, there's all these signals going back and forth from consumers to producers about increasing and decreasing supply and demand. Giving control of that to politicians and bureaucrats is insane. They cannot possibly have the knowledge to run things.
The irony of this is that capitalist organisations traditionally have always been centrally planned in terms of how they operate internally. You know, they all have a CEO at the top, a board of directors, and then multiple layers of bureaucracy. Because they're run in the profit interests of a few people, they are typically organised in a very hierarchical, bureaucratic manner to ensure that those minority interests are served. If you think that central planning is a bad thing in and of itself, which I happen to agree with, then why shouldn't workers run their own workplaces as opposed to having them centrally planned by capitalist CEOs? What reason is there for the boss to be there when we have evidence that workers can run their own workplaces just as effectively, if not more, and that this model is fundamentally more suited to meeting our psychological needs?
That's why there were bread shortages in the Soviet Union, and soap and shoes and butter and.
But again, socialists don't necessarily want the kind of system that existed in the Soviet Union. There are ways that you can have a socialist system without tyranny, e.g. revolutionary Spain, the Free Territory of Ukraine, the Zapatista communities in Chiapas, and also some of what's been going on more recently in Rojava. Because, you know, like, unlike right-wing libertarians, we left libertarians actually have revolutions.
In 1989, Russian President Boris Yeltsin went to a US grocery store. His mind was blown.
You know, it's like a really cringe-worthy attempt to seem hip and trendy and down with the kids. Hey guys, didn't you know socialism's bad? No.
All of these choices, how is this even possible?
One of the great many paradoxes of capitalist society is that you have lots of choice in the things that are of no consequence whatsoever, and no choice in the things that actually matter. Hundreds of different brands of toothpaste, 2 political parties. Oh, and by the way, they both have the same structural obligation to represent the interests of the upper classes anyway, so you may as well stay at home on election day and masturbate instead. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Well, you let people buy and sell goods and respond to incentives and price signals, things tend to work itself out.
This is just a theoretical assertion. You haven't given any evidence for it. What examples do you have of unhampered market forces actually working in practice? There was Bitcoin, which collapsed. On the rare occasions where people actually do attempt to create societies based on total free market capitalism, they collapse almost immediately. Markets are inherently unstable. They go through boom and bust cycles. It's silly to treat them as though they're this infallible force of nature that should never be criticized.
Why is capitalism treated as this evil thing?
People treat capitalism as an evil thing because of the suffering that's caused by capitalist institutions across the globe. For example, look at what the American United Fruit Company did in Guatemala over the course of most of the 20th century. They bought up the country's assets and laid waste to the welfare system, plunging most of the domestic population into sickness and poverty. In the latter half of the 20th century, there was a one-sided campaign of violence against the Guatemalan population which lasted for over 30 years, attempting to crush popular resistance to the neo-feudal system that had been created by the United Fruit Company and enforced by a series of military governments. Or look at what happened in Chile in 1973, in which the United States and the Chilean armed forces overthrew a democratically elected government and installed a military dictatorship, so that they could implement the kind of free market neoliberal policies that you support. The economy was ruined and tens of thousands of people were put into internment camps, tortured and killed. One of the main reasons why people have a problem with capitalism is that capitalist institutions play a key role in these kinds of state atrocities.
Less than a third of millennials have a positive view of capitalism.
Perhaps that's because we're the generation that's been well and truly shafted by Thatcherite economic policy.
Capitalism is just the economy controlled by the people.
This is false. Capitalism has three components: private ownership of the means of production, exchange of goods and services for profit in a market economy, and wage labour. In a capitalist workplace, workers don't run the workplace. You have to take orders from a boss. At the very least, an economy controlled by the people themselves would have to involve worker self-management. And in practice, capitalism just doesn't allow for that.
As opposed to the state for profit.
In practice, capitalist economies require the state to fulfill a number of functions: to protect the private property of the capitalists, to repress the working class, and to deal with the inherent volatility of markets, so that the capitalist system doesn't just collapse immediately and can be preserved in the long term. This is why I actually think that the capitalist elite in America wouldn't allow for something like full-blown anarcho-capitalism to actually gain any traction. But they'll let people play around with it anyway because it's a convenient distraction from real politics that are actually a threat to the status quo.
Profit is evil.
Profit is not an evil thing. It's a reward for producing something that people want to buy.
Who made the iPhone? Workers in China. Who made the profit? Not workers in China. They get jack shit. Doesn't seem very fair to me.
Exchange is voluntary in a capitalist system. People buy an item because they value that more than their money, and both sides are made better off by the exchange.
If you assume that the exchange takes place within a total vacuum and ignore any external circumstances whatsoever, then yes, this is mutually beneficial in a very trivial sense. Suppose that I've got a lorry filled with bottles of water. I go into the desert and I find someone dying of thirst. I then offer that person a bottle of water for the low price of £1 million. They accept the bottle of water and agree voluntarily to go into crippling debt for the rest of their life. By your logic, this is a mutually beneficial exchange, and it is in a very trivial sense. They obviously value the bottle of water more than they value the £1 million that they'll be paying back for the rest of their life. They've agreed to the exchange voluntarily, so everything's fine, right? Well, no. Clearly I've taken advantage of them being in a vulnerable situation, and they don't have a meaningful choice. Simply saying that an exchange is fine so long as both parties agree to it ignores the circumstances under which they have agreed, and whether they had a meaningful choice in the matter.
If something is overpriced, the producer will have to adjust the price to reflect market value or face going out of business.
Businesses don't actually adjust prices to produce market clearance. Rather, prices are set to a level that will allow businesses to have a surplus that they can use to enter new markets around the world, produce new products, and invest in future production. There are all sorts of reasons why Austrian price formation is wank. And for a more detailed analysis, I recommend you check out the left libertarian's critique of Austrian price formation, which will be linked in the description.
Too many people blame the problems in the current system on capitalism, which is absolutely frustrating.
No. Please, no. Don't say it. Please just don't say it.
Capitalism is the separation of economy and state.
Perhaps in rosy ANCAP land, but in the real world, capitalists have a mutually beneficial relationship with the state, where they contribute financially to political campaigns in exchange for policy packages that advance their economic interests. Capitalism is the word that we use to describe the economic system that emerged historically after feudalism, characterised by three major components: private ownership of the means of production, markets, and wage labour. And historically, that system has always developed alongside the state apparatus. To ignore that and just call it corporatism instead isn't at all helpful for understanding the world that we actually live in.
Wall Street bailouts, corporate handouts, those are the opposite of capitalism. Do not blame capitalism on them.
Well, the capitalists seem to be pretty happy with them. If you look at the whole course of how capitalism developed historically, it's pretty clear that capitalists That's to say, bosses don't actually care very much about having a wonderful free market. So long as they're making profit, they're happy.
To me, the face of capitalism is the entrepreneur who risks everything because he or she has an idea that they believe will make people's lives better. That's cool.
Ah, the cult of the entrepreneur. This is a very romanticised picture of what capitalists are actually like. A study published in the Journal of Labour Economics found that the likelihood of people becoming capitalists depended to a large extent on whether they had received an inheritance or gift, rather than possessing certain risk-friendly personality traits. Another study, published in the Strategic Organisation Journal, found that entrepreneurs were not more likely to have risk-friendly personality traits than the general population.
Socialism, government control, fewer choices. That's not cool.
It's also not a fair description of socialism. To be honest, I don't think that you're a particularly bad person. You don't seem like you're being particularly deceptive here. Rather, I just get the impression that you do genuinely want a free society. You just don't really know very much about what socialism is. And I think that if you were familiar with the non-state forms of socialism, you would be a lot more friendly towards them. I would argue that if you actually want a free society, you ought to support non-hierarchical, worker-controlled organisations as opposed to traditional capitalist enterprises. Because in these institutions, people have a greater degree of control over their own lives. And if that's what you want, then you should be a socialist. That concludes episode 8 of Anarchist Commentaries. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm considering doing a bite-sized video series on reasons why I'm not an ANCAP, so let me know what your thoughts about that are. So yeah, thanks for watching, bye bye.